Hello and welcome to the video. I'm over here. It's another one of these videos. This is Shannon. You might know him as Sneaky FPV if you're playing with custom fonts in HD0, Walksnail or the DJI WTFOS system. Sneaky is the gentleman that's been doing an awful lot of work recently, producing lots of different custom fonts for Betaflight, Ardu Pilot, iNav and others on all of those systems. And he's been doing that for quite a few months now. And just recently you saw my announcement that the Walksnail guys have released a new beta firmware which fixes a lot of the issues that we've been experiencing as pilots in the Walksnail land, specifically with custom fonts. And that's down to the fact that the custom fonts these days have multiple pages. They're so big, these fonts have so many icons that they're kind of divided up into sets or pages. And the Walksnail goggles didn't know how to turn the page in order to get to the element they wanted. So things like your direction to home arrow suddenly becoming alphanumeric characters rather than a little arrow is exactly what the problem is, but that's all been fixed. Now, we need to support developers like this. Shannon hasn't asked me to do this bit, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to put a link to his website down below that includes all of his work on all the different fonts, but here on the title page you can see there's this little thing here called Buy Me a Coffee. Please, 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 if you are a pilot who use this gentleman's work, who enjoy it, who get a lot of fun out of it, no matter what the operating system, what the goggles are, click on that link and send him a couple of bucks. Again, he hasn't asked me to do this. I'm doing this because these kind of guys are doing this stuff for free. He's working very closely with the Walksnail team in particular at the moment to give us all of this new technology. So we need to, first of all, let him know we're using this stuff. Second, to also show our thanks. And third, if we can kick him a couple of bucks for a cup of coffee, I think that's just a nice thing to do, and it also keeps him motivated to keep developing and keep bringing us this cool stuff. So Shannon, for me personally as a pilot, thank you so much, because I've been using your stuff for quite a long time and I was heartbroken when it got to the point where the page switching issue occurred, because it meant I couldn't use your fab fonts on my Walksnail flying because my direction to home and also the altitude indicator kind of went all screwy. The basic stuff worked, but the really, really good stuff I like didn't. Now again, links to everything we're about to talk about is down below. So links to Shannon's website, also a link to Shannon's Sneaky FPV YouTube channel. I subscribe to it and I watch it because Shannon will put stuff on there of new stuff that he's developing. So if you want to see some of the cool new fonts that are coming out, being tested, things like the nighttime font. So there's one that's like a green. So if you like to fly at night, then there's the opportunity to have a font that's a little bit easier to read on darker screens without blowing your eyes out from the white color of the font. Those kind of things have come around as well. And I saw those well in advance of them being released on his YouTube page. So Shannon, there's not only all of the cool stuff that's currently come out with a Walksnail update that's come out recently, you are up to your eyes in lots of stuff that's coming out that you're currently working on as well.
I guess where my journey started with WTFOS and early on in the piece getting interested in doing the font development for those systems, particularly supporting the flight controllers. There was stuff that was there with Betaflight, but we didn't have anything there from an iNav perspective, and I just sort of took it from there and went on. And then moved on to helping with some of the early font stuff with HD0. And at the moment, any of the stuff that you see on the HD0 side of things is stuff that I've developed for HD0, and of late my efforts have been predominantly on the Walksnail side of things. I love doing what I do, and not sponsored in any way, not paid for what I do. All the equipment I've got, any of the systems I've got is all self-purchased because I love doing what I'm doing.
Well, and thank you so much for doing it, because I must admit the custom fonts are a lot better than the embedded fonts. And it's by the sound of it, though, the embedded fonts you talked about in an earlier chat we had about the embedded fonts potentially changing for things like iNav, Betaflight, Ardu Pilots and others, haven't you?
Yes, that's right. You'll see with the latest firmware that the Betaflight one in particular, near ready font that's been put into the beta test, the beta firmware for Betaflight, on Walksnail, and that gives you a bit of a flavour for what's coming in the full release. The iNav embedded font, the RG Pilot, and the Betaflight one will all have a very similar look and feel, so it unifies the interface in terms of flight control experience for pilots, hopefully as part of the full release that's coming out.
One of the things we talked about doing, and the main reason for this video, was to run through, specifically with Walksnail, some of the tips and tricks to get the most out of the system. I've already talked about one issue, which hopefully is now fixed in the beta firmware, which will hopefully go gold soon, beta as I'm recording this video, which is that issue where your direction to home arrow went all screwy, and now with the page 2 support, it works okay with Shannon's fonts. So what Shannon very kindly did was put together all of the top stuff that tends to happen. I'm going to put time codes down below to these, so if you have one in particular, go and check them out. But if you are a Walksnail pilot and you're using custom fonts, I would heartily recommend just sit back, watch all 7 or 8 of these, because at the end of it, you'll have a much better experience with not only the custom fonts, but with the Walksnail system overall, if you kind of follow these tips and tricks. So again, thanks to Shannon for bringing this list together, because it definitely includes all the stuff that I was going to talk about and quite a few other things as well. So first thing we're going to talk about then is, with the latest firmware, the location of the fonts on the SD card in your Walksnail goggles or your VRX unit has changed. It now has to be in a user font directory. If it's not there, it won't find the fonts. Now, historically, this wasn't an issue. It now, as of the latest version, is something that you have to do. In fact, I'm about to make a video shortly when the code is finally finished. Shannon is putting the final shine on it. A tool that he's creating which allow you to upload multiple custom fonts onto your goggles and be able to switch between them. And one of the things that tool does is not only create the little ini file that's needed for the Walksnail goggles to read the fonts correctly, but also actually puts them onto the SD card in the user font directory already.
There's limited flash memory space to store the fonts on the VRX or the goggles. So the other thing that we were looking at doing is increasing the support for other flight control systems on the goggles from an embedded font perspective, which means that they live on the goggles or the VRX. You don't have to have them on the SD card, but they need that room for other features that are upcoming.
Fab. So stay tuned. There will be a video showing how to use that tool. I'm sure Shannon will be sharing it on his social media and other places as well. But I will definitely be using it because I do like the idea of easily being able to pick 2 or 3 of the different fonts for whichever flight control systems I'm interested in, stick them in a directory and run this little app. And it'll basically create all the concatenated ini file information and then also copy all the relevant files onto your SD card into that user font directory. So stay tuned for that. Next one to talk about then is quite a big one. This is something that I have been plagued with recently, and this is the fact that you can get on Walksnail, again, this is awful Walksnail stuff, flickering OSD. And I've had it. In the old versions of the software, it didn't really happen very much. And what seems to be happening is that the data packets that get sent from the avatar system in the model, it seems to miss 1 or 2. And when it gets missed, the on-screen display kind of just drops out and then reappears. So it isn't flickering. What it's doing is it's kind of been removed from the OSD or just showing the information that it's received. And then when it gets a full lot of on-screen display MSP telemetry back into the goggles, then it kind of reappears is what's actually happening. There are a couple of things, aren't there, that you found that can improve the situation with it. And although before we get into that, just to be aware, Walksnail are aware of these issues and they are working on them. So, but these are things that you can do now if you're plagued by this issue to help you reduce the amount of flickering.
The biggest thing that we see impacting the flickering is the fact that people use VTX recording and they've got that turned on. That seems to be the most flicker-inducing thing that we have at the moment. So that sort of compounds or exacerbates the flickering in general. As Lee was saying, there's 2 main things. One is the VTX recording. The other is is about the signal, and it's about range, it's about signal strength, it's about your antennas that you use. So when the signal starts to drop and you start to lose some packets coming from the VTX to the goggles, some data, then the goggles or the VRX actually go back to the VTX and say, send me that again. So it retries, and often that when it's retrying, we lose some of the OSD data, which is why we're seeing the flickering occur. So the solutions to that is turn off your VTX recording, at least for this version of the firmware, and that's been evident in other versions of the firmware as well, in previous versions. So that's one side of it. And the other one is to use some really good quality antennas. We know that at range, particularly with all the testing that's been happening, that a good set of antennas, particularly the transmit antenna, is really important in terms of being able to achieve some longer range without having a huge amount of flickering. You'll always get it at range, particularly at the edge of range, but it's certainly close in. It's less likely for you to get flicker if you've got really good antennas.
So the key things are, if you are currently experiencing flickering, is turn off your recording on your VTX or your avatar unit. Also, I would declutter the screen, take some of the elements off. That is also going to help. The amount of data that then has to be sent gets smaller, gives the avatar unit a better chance of actually getting that out before it needs to do something else. And finally, the range and the sensitivity of the antennas, they will help as well, because it's not only the receiving antennas, which you think about a lot, it's also that single transmitting antenna that's on the goggles. That needs to be a good quality antenna. If you use omnidirectional, great. But if you're flying away from yourself and you're trying to get a little bit further, if that's legal and safe for you to do so, having some kind of directional antenna like a patch or something pointed in that direction is going to help a lot. Next one then is talk about playback on the on-screen display. Now, in the early versions of the Walksnail system, playback of your DVR and have the OSD kind of put over the top was a pipe dream. Then we got it, and it's now, with the latest version of the software, changed a little bit as well, because in the previous versions, Shannon did some videos talking about this, the font file had to have a very specific name for the OSD to be overlaid on your DVR when you played it back in the goggles. Had to be called iNav or BTFL or whatever. It doesn't have to be that now. It's changed in the latest version. So whatever OSD you are using on the goggles, that information is recorded as part of the DVR. So when you play it back, it will then allow you to watch that OSD stuff and use exactly the same font. So don't worry about that anymore. If you've watched videos about it with the latest version of firmware on the Walksnail stuff, it'll just use the font that you were flying with at the time. Just make sure that it is on your SD card in that user font directory. Next thing then we're going to talk about is firmware downgrading. Not even a thing. Downgrading process. I've had issues before where I have upgraded things to test stuff here and then struggled to downgrade them. And you may have the same issue, and by default, Walksnail doesn't want you to be able to downgrade the goggles. So if you update to, let's just pick numbers out the air, 30.20.10, just for example, is the firmware version. If you then try and put 29.80.10 on the goggles, it will go, oh, well, that's less. I'm not applying that update. You can still downgrade if you want to. If maybe there's a feature or it doesn't work for something that you're trying to do, you can, if you just rename the file, the firmware file that you put on the SD card to flash from. So say it was 30.20.10. If you just rename it to be 40.20.10, then it will just go, okay, that's a later firmware file, and it'll flash it. It won't change the version of the firmware that gets installed. It's just a little trick to fool Walksnail into thinking that the update it's about to do is for a later version, because by default it doesn't allow you to downgrade, but using that will be fine. So talking about why people want to downgrade, and talking about how they might move up and then find that something isn't performing as well as they thought it would and then want to move down. That brings us nicely onto the next thing that we wanted to talk about, which was the kind of smearing and compression artifacts that you can sometimes get in things like the Walksnail system. And this is typically seen not by pilots up at 200 feet overlooking the beautiful sunshine in a sunny morning. It is more your quad guys racing over the grass at 80 miles an hour at about 6 inches. And what you will find is that the grass in particular will look really weird and smeary. It's worthwhile, I think, taking a second to talk about why that happens. There is only a certain amount of bandwidth that the system has in order to send all of the pixels across to appear in your goggles. And the way it actually works, it doesn't redraw the frame of video completely from the top left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner every single time. What it's actually doing is it is sending the changed pixels, and there's lots of funky compression algorithms and all kinds of wacky stuff. So if you are flying and from one frame to the other, you know, the only thing that moves is that bird in the distance goes 2 pixels to the left as it flies across your screen. That's easy to get that data down. However, if you are asking the system to update the entire field of view, which has changed dramatically from the last image it took, it has to kind of cheat because there's only so much bandwidth. So what it does is like a zip file. You can think of it like it takes the data and it has to compress it so it will fit within the bandwidth that's available. And when it's uncompressed at the other side, you get that artifacts or smearing. Now, this is something that happens on all digital systems. It isn't unique to Walksnail, but it can appear more pronounced if you miss a couple of tricks. The first one is that there are a couple of modes on systems like Walksnail, DJI and HD0 where you can change the bandwidth that's available. So, you know, you have like the 25 and the 50 megabit bandwidth modes in places like DJI. You have a similar thing in Walksnail. If you increase it to 50 megabit bandwidth, then there is a lot more room to get all that data down, and it will dramatically reduce the amount of spurious. If you are flying on the base settings, and the issue is that when you reset the goggles, you can sometimes get in a situation where you reset the bandwidth. Make sure that if you're flying close to stuff and you're getting smeariness, number one tip is increase it to 50 megabits, and then that will help a lot. And that's also the reason that the new race mode that's come out in the new firmware. The cool thing is the new race mode actually aligns the channels, 20 megabit channels, bandwidth channels, onto the analog channels that we've used forever. So it means that you can race a Walksnail system alongside analog FPV. Unfortunately, the bandwidth for those channels is only 20 megabits. So I've just told you you need 50 megabits in order, you know, to reduce the amount of compression that's needed to increase the quality of the image. But now we're going to try and race with only 20 megabits. Well, that's the reason why the actual size, the resolution of the frame has come down so much, because that is the frame that can be updated successfully at the speeds that race pilots want with only 20 megabits of bandwidth. So hopefully that helps. So the big tip is, if you're getting things like smearing and compression, then make sure that your bandwidth settings are set to 50 megabits, not any of the other settings. Go for your highest setting, and just be aware that that may mean the amount of the bandwidth that you use might mean that you, if you have a flying buddy, have to be a little bit further apart so that you don't step on each other's signal. But that's the way to reduce that amount of stuff. And I'm seeing this with pilots who go from one firmware version to another, or install a new system in a new machine, don't upgrade the bandwidth, and then complain that it looks like just sludge. That's usually the issue. Any other things from you, Shannon, on that one? Because I know that's a common criticism I hear of particularly things like the Walksnail system, but it's not unique to Walksnail.
No, that's right. It's DJI. I've got their focus mode that, you know, reduces or keeps the center of the screen clearer than the outside of the screen. HD0 a little bit differently set up from a latency perspective, and they manage it a little bit differently. But you're right, there's only so much room you've got there to deal with in terms of the video data that's coming across in that carrier size. As you're saying, it really impacts the multi-rotor pilots. The wing pilots don't observe it as much unless you're doing a lot of low flying. Because the amount of pixels and the rate of change on the screen is nowhere near the same as a racing pilot.
So the next thing to talk about then is something that you made me aware of. I didn't know about this until we started chatting, and that is the fact that there is the ability to turn on a debug on-screen display and have that debug information saved into an SRT file. Can you just explain a little bit about what that is? Because I think this is a really cool feature that I didn't know about until we had a natter.
So the debug information, firstly, to turn it on, you adjust your zoom level. There is a setting called zoom. It steps from 10% up to 100%. By default, it's on 100%. I don't think any of these settings have any other impact apart from the 10%, so I don't know really what the idea with that particular setting was. But if it is set to 10%, you'll find that you'll get in the sort of upper left-hand side of your vision in the goggles or VRX, you'll have a red OSD that sort of sits behind your normal flight OSD, and that contains things like antenna information, temperature settings, or temperature of the VTX, temperature of the goggles or the VRX, information about your signal strength and signal to noise ratios, etc. So that's handy, particularly if you're doing any bench testing and you want to be aware of the temperature of the VTX while it's sitting there, making sure that you're keeping it in check. The other thing it's handy for is if you want to potentially log, the signal strength over time of a flight, you can turn on having the debug information saved in your SRT file like you would normally have as part of your DVR. It just replaces it with a different set of information that is essentially what is in the debug screen. So you might want to track the way that the signal to noise ratio happens over a particular flight path, because you might observe that you get signal dropouts at you're passing a particular spot, and you might want to log that and just try and determine semi-scientifically what it is that might be impacting that. So that's turned on by putting a text file on the base folder of your SD card, and I think from memory it's called debug_in_srt.txt, and once that's in there, it'll start to log a different set of information in your SRT file.
So a great feature for those of you that maybe want to track those kind of things, signal to noise ratio and those other issues. Be aware that the SRT information, when you turn it on using that text file, it's going to be the debug information, not the normal stuff that would normally be in the SRT. It's either or. Last thing then to talk about for today, because I've had you for ages, so thank you for the time again, is to talk about OSD Overlay Tools. Now, there was one that I did a video on, I'll put the insert here, a while ago. That was a tool that created basically a PNG image, I think it was, with the frame by frame, and then overlaid it onto the video. It took a very long time to run, but it was exciting. I loved it for no other reason than it allowed me to import all of your different OSDs and put them on top of an existing bit of footage that I had, just to see what they would look like, because that was the only way back at the time before you started publishing the little snapshots of how you could see what everything looked like. However, there is a new OSD tool from a gentleman called Alexander Van Sass. I'll put a link down below. This is the website. I'll probably make a video on this to have a look at it. It's a much more modern tool. It's actively being developed. And also it's Alexander and Shannon are talking to each other as well. So that means these guys are all part of the community along with Walksnail, which makes me very happy, because it means that rather than lots of people working in their own little silos and causing issues for each other, they're actually collaborating, which is the kind of thing that makes my heart feel very happy. So I think that's everything that we had in the list today, Shannon. That's been incredibly useful. Thank you so much again for all the work that you do and the time. Again, time codes down below for all of those different pieces. So if you have anything specific around the Walksnail stuff or the OSD custom font stuff, then put the question down below. Now I know the expert, but don't forget, links in the description to both Shannon's YouTube stuff, his pages. I'll put a link to also Alexander Van Sass's OSD tool as well, so you can go and check out everything we've talked about. But my last thing, and if you take nothing away from this video, do go and visit his pages and click on that. Send him a couple of bucks and buy him a cup of coffee. Thank you for watching the video. If you watch my videos and find them useful, then please take a moment to hit the like and subscribe button. It helps the channel a lot. If you really like what I'm doing here, you can become a Patreon and support the time I spend helping others and get access to lots of exclusive benefits. Link is in the video description. Remember that all the videos on the channel are organized into playlists, so you can easily use those playlists to find all the videos on a subject that you are interested in. Add Painless 360 to your searches on Google and YouTube, and it'll help you find my content for any particular topic. Thanks again for watching, and as always, happy flying.